For the past 14 years, I've worked as an airline pilot out of Hartsfield-Jackson here in Atlanta. Thankfully, I've only experienced a handful of in-flight emergencies during my career, and most of them were fairly easily dealt with. There was only one incident in which I felt my life was in danger, where I found myself faced with the real, I might not make it out of this moment that all pilots dread. And this is the story of that incident. To properly tell this story, I need to explain something about how commercial aircraft operate, and for the sake of brevity and comprehension, I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. On most 737s, there are three sources of what we call bleed air that are used to pressurize the aircraft's cabin. Cabins are pressurized because the air is so thin at 35,000 feet that people can't breathe it, so these sources of bleed air ensure there's enough breathable air in the cabin for safe travel. In theory, you only need one source of bleed air to keep a cabin pressurized, but modern aircraft feature three, so two of them can essentially function as backups. So, on the day in question, the aircraft I was due to pilot only had two sources of bleed air, as the one on the second engine wasn't functioning. The maintenance guys had taken a look at the plane and were unable to repair the bleed, but since our two other sources of bleed air were functioning, the aircraft was deferred. This means that it was declared safe to fly because the chances of our two remaining sources malfunctioning were slim to none. No pilot is 100% happy flying an aircraft that isn't completely malfunction-free, but that's just the world we live in. If every plane on the planet was grounded every time something went wrong, the global economy would simply just grind to a halt. Well, immediately after takeoff, our APU failed, meaning that we only had one bleed source to pressurize the cabin, that being from engine number 1. Obviously, this made me very, very nervous, because if that source failed, we'd have nothing to keep the cabin pressurized, and that can be deadly. However, since the scheduled flight was due to be a relatively short one, I was optimistic that I could get us up to our low cruising altitude and keep us there for the remainder of the flight to minimize risk. So once I got the plane to just over 8,000 feet, I messaged dispatch and maintenance using the ACARS system, which is basically just satellite-based text messaging service that the aircraft uses to communicate with ground crews. They replied saying they believed the flight was still safe to continue on one bleed source, so we went. But then, as we reached 25,000 feet, I remember trying to inhale and feeling the telltale sensation of air gently seeping out of my lungs. Finding myself unable to breathe normally, my eyes shoot up to the cabin altitude gauge, which was showing that cabin altitude was at 8,000 feet and rising. Not only that, but the cabin altitude was rising at the exact same rate of climb as the aircraft, meaning that we'd somehow lost all pressurization capabilities, resulting in rapid depressurization of the cabin. Seconds later, I hear the warning chime as a message appears on our crew alert system that simply reads, "Bleed 1 fail." With no sources of bleed air at 25,000 feet, I needed to get us at a safe altitude as soon as possible. If I couldn't, we'd be out of breathable air, and we'd be in a whole world of trouble. Rapid cabin depressurization is a deadly phenomenon, and is actually the reason that Helios Airways Flight 522 crashed back in 2005. A loss of pressurization incapacitated the crew, leaving the aircraft flying in a loop on autopilot until it ran out of fuel, at which point it crashed into a mountain range, killing all 121 passengers and crew on board. The incident pretty much went under the radar of the mainstream media, and very few people remember it these days, but the Flight 522 incident constitutes a living nightmare for anyone in aviation circles, and it scared the crap out of the Greek government and the military too. Because no ground crews could contact Flight 522, it was marked down as a renegade aircraft which had possibly been hijacked by terrorists. 2 Greek F-16s were tasked with intercepting the aircraft and faced the possibility of having to shoot it down before it could be used as a weapon against civilian targets. The F-16 pilots eventually flew close enough to the aircraft that they were able to observe the first officer slumped motionless at the controls, while the captain's seat was empty. They also reported that oxygen masks were dangling in the passenger cabin and were unable to spot any passengers who were utilizing the oxygen masks. It was a bittersweet moment for all involved because as much as the F-16 could safely declare that Flight 522 wasn't a renegade aircraft, they were then forced to observe what was essentially a ghost plane. No one was in control of it, and it just flew in circles on autopilot until it ran out of fuel and crashed. Like I said, it's an incident that very few people remember outside of aviation circles, but I was haunted by such a prospect. And that day, when I realized that exact same thing was happening to the aircraft I was flying, I felt a kind of terror that I'm not sure I can put into words. Knowing I had to act quickly and decisively, I started by throwing off my sunglasses and headset before donning my full-face oxygen mask and smoke goggles. The mask provides breathable air with a forced flow and can do so up to an altitude of 41,000 feet. Naturally, my first officer did the same thing, which gave everyone in the aircraft a fighting chance of making it out alive, because as you can imagine, unconscious pilots means everyone is screwed. We then informed the cabin crew of the emergency and began initiating an emergency descent, pushing just over to our maximum speed while deploying the speed brakes to generate maximum drag. Once the ground crew became aware of our situation, we received clearance to descend to 10,000 feet before executing a 180-degree turn to land back at Hartsfield-Jackson. To their credit, air traffic control did an incredible job at vectoring aircraft out of our proposed flight path, meaning they went about clearing the airspace so we could land safely. This was no mean feat either, as I'm sure some of you know just how busy the airspace around Atlanta can be, given how almost every flight around the southeast has a connection there. About 5 to 10 minutes into our ordeal, the cabin pressure had almost reached hazardous levels, but not quite high enough for the oxygen mask in the cabin to automatically deploy. During emergencies like that, we tend to not inform passengers of every little detail, as it tends to just make them panic. But I'd be willing to bet that many of them noticed something about the level of breathable air on board, just not enough to realize that something was seriously wrong. Besides, at the rate we were descending, we were pretty much in the clear, as with every 1,000-foot drop, the cabin pressure became more and more normalized. Minutes later, we landed back at ATL on the longest runway with fire trucks rolling in to assist us, just in case something really went wrong with the landing. And fortunately, none of the passengers or crew reported any injuries from the sudden increase in cabin altitude, as people with certain medical conditions can suffer complications during such an event. Once we were safely on the ground, I parked us up at the gate, then made an announcement to the passengers about what had just happened. I made sure to use plenty of layman's terms, as well as downplaying the whole thing so I didn't scare the crap out of everyone with the details of how we almost just lost our lives. By happenstance, we had 12 Japanese tourists on our flight that were on a tour of the East Coast, and in their ignorance, they were very upset that their trip was inconvenienced by the emergency. Without knowing the full details, they had somehow gotten into their heads that we were just being overly safety conscious and that the flight could have continued if it wasn't for overbearing health and safety protocols. I ended up personally talking with them via translator, and I gave them a full and very detailed explanation of what happened while we were up in the air. As I explained what happened, their facial expressions morphed from disgruntled frowns to surprised and fearful, then finally to outrageously grateful and thankful. Before I walked away, all 12 of them, including the translator, were thanking me in a mix of Japanese and English, and all bowed out of respect and gratitude. I tried telling them it was no big deal and that I was just doing my job, but they saw right through the downplaying and the display of humility and straight up thanked me for saving their lives. Following the averted disaster, I ended up swapping airplanes to one that was fully functional, and we completed the flight as planned, albeit around 3 hours behind schedule. After getting home later that day, I knew I wasn't going to be able to sleep properly, so I just didn't try. I stayed up until the early hours of the next morning, knowing I had the day off, and thought about the several complaints the airline received about the flights being delayed for 3 hours. I think only the Japanese tourists actually knew how close they were to dying mid-flight, and while the majority of passengers were probably indifferent to the inconvenience, there were certainly a handful that complained after having dodged a huge bullet. I don't blame them, not one bit. Because, as we all know, ignorance is bliss. This happened when I was about 16 years old, so over 20 years ago now. I have 5 younger siblings and my little sister would have been 5 years old. We lived in a bad neighborhood, in the housing projects. Our neighbor was nice, but she always had sketchy-looking people hanging around, especially men. One day, these 2 new guys started hanging out there every day. They'd always be outside smoking or just sitting on her porch. They made me really uncomfortable. They were always staring at me and would sometimes try to get me to walk over and talk to them, or they'd come over into our yard when my parents weren't home and talk to me, asking me if I had a boyfriend and asking me if I wanted some beer or weed. I was a goody two-shoe Mormon girl, so I always was like, no thanks, I have to go inside now, and they were probably both around 30 years old or so. Then they started coming over and asking to use our phone when my parents weren't home. My parents always let the neighbors use our phone, so I never said no, but I would just pass it through the door and make sure they stayed on the porch. They'd sometimes ask to come in or try to talk to me, but I would tell them no because my parents weren't home. And now I realize how dumb that was because they could have just pushed the door open. But I was raised to ignore red flags and be polite and sweet at all times. Anyway, we had a little dog and I always took him outside early in the morning on a leash. I was out one morning and one of the guys came outside and stood there staring at me for a few minutes and then went back in. I brought the dog inside and just a few minutes later, there's a quiet knock on the door. I opened it and both guys are there and one says, "We just saw your baby sister out by the highway. You need to come get her." I panicked and ran outside with them. I started to run down on our street toward the highway and one of them says, "No, we'll drive you down there. We need to hurry." I seriously took 2 steps towards the truck before I realized what I was doing. I stopped and said that I needed to go back inside and tell my parents, and the man closest to me grabbed my arm and jerked me towards the truck yelling, "We have to go now. She's going to get hit by a car." I instantly felt sick and just yelled, "Let go of me." He dropped my arm and I ran back inside my house. I ran in my parents' bedroom to wake them up and my little sister was sleeping in their bed with them. I woke everyone up because I was freaking out and my dad ran outside and the guys in their truck were long gone. I never saw them at my neighbor's house again. I wish I could say that my parents called the police or something, but they just kind of shrugged it off and made excuses like maybe they saw another kid that looked like your sister. My friend, a 25-year-old female from college, told me a harrowing story that happened to her and her friends in high school. She's from Buffalo, New York, and often went on camping trips to local upstate campgrounds. When she was a senior, her and her 4 of her friends went to a campsite fitted with rows of cabins on the water that people could rent. As the sun went down, the girls noticed that their neighbors, a few cabins down, a group of guys similar in age, were playing music and grooving around the campfire, drinking beers. One of the guys asked them if they all wanted to join. When they got over there and started hanging out with the guys, everything seemed completely normal and they were having a fun time. As the night progressed, one of the guys then started to get blackout drunk and eventually pulled out a revolver that he said belonged to his dad. He started waving it around and playing with it. This obviously freaked everyone out, his own friends included. Eventually, he started pointing the gun at his head and laughing while his friends were yelling at him to put it away and how that wasn't funny. The girls at this point were fairly disturbed and told the guys that they should get back to their cabin and say their goodbyes. When they got back to their cabin, they talked about how freaky that was and expressed concern for the drunk guy. They then moved on to other topics of conversation and forgot about it for the time being. A few hours later, sometime in the middle of the night, they heard a loud bang coming from the direction of the neighbor's cabin. Shortly after this, a brigade of cop cars showed up to the scene. One officer came to my friend's cabin and started asking them questions about the cabin they visited earlier that night. When my friend asked the officer what happened, he explained that the kid had shot himself in the head in front of his friends. They weren't able to discern if it was them taking their own life or an accident. And my friend to this day still has PTSD over this incident and explained that she rarely goes camping anymore. I'm a 19-year-old female, and today I was freaked out on my walk home. I live not too far from my favorite coffee bean, and I really wanted to go since I had finished school already. I'm going to community college and still take the bus everywhere, but since this coffee place was right near my house, I decided to walk like I usually do. It was around 2 p.m. when I got there and everything was normal. It wasn't until my walk back that I felt uncomfortable. I lived probably half a mile away. When I crossed the street leading to my block, I saw a man with red hair, box-dyed bright red, who seemed youngish but had growing stubble and looked older than me. He had a drawstring bag and was walking opposite to me on the crosswalk. While I was passing, he asked me if I had cigarettes, and I said no and continued walking. I figured it was just some random guy who couldn't afford cigarettes, considering there was a smoke shop about half a block away. As I kept walking, not more than probably 20 steps into the next block, I hear a very fast walking behind me, and immediately I assume it's someone on a run or something and move to the side. But it's the same man. I guess he walked the opposite way of where he was originally headed just to talk to me because he started saying something and I didn't understand him. I looked and suddenly he was asking if he could use my phone. He told me he was a college student and needed to call his mom. He then asked if I go to school here, and I said, "What school?" And he just said, "The college near here." I could tell something was up and was scared he was even talking to me in the first place since it was an empty neighborhood and I'm a young-looking girl by myself. I lied and just told him no. And just for reference, the college I went to and nearest to my location was a mile away, and I felt weird that he didn't even name the school. I didn't want to be talking to him, but I was just trying to walk away, and I guess I was nervous. He then asked to use my phone again, and I was so nervous. And I stood there for a few seconds contemplating what to do, and I don't know why, I just said okay. I was half expecting him to run off with it or something, but he dialed a number and held it to his ear. He didn't say hello or tell anyone it was him. He just said, "Okay, bye," and hung up. And then he handed my phone back, and I told him I was leaving now, and he told me that she said that she'd call him back. Why would his mom say that if they barely spoke for 1 second and he never even introduced himself? I said there was a restaurant down the street and he should ask for their phone instead, and he just replied with, "Oh yeah." Next, I started walking to my house. Mind you, we were on the corner of my block already. He started walking the same way. He asked if I lived here, and I said no, and that I was waiting for a friend. And then he asked if I was walking that direction, the one I was already headed toward, and he followed behind me, probably about 10 feet. I ignored him, and he asked if I had a boyfriend, and I told him yes. And it was true, but mostly I said it for him to leave me alone. I know it was stupid, but I didn't go around the block or anything because he was walking pretty fast and I didn't want him to talk to me. It's a pretty empty neighborhood during the day. When he was around 20 feet behind me, I decided to not go around the block and just go inside. I guess I just felt so weird and I didn't have a car or anything, so I couldn't just wait there. I pretended someone was talking to me on the phone and grabbed my keys out of my bag, and I walked so fast to my house and unlocked my door and closed it. Within a minute of me locking it, knowing he was still behind me and hearing his footsteps, the doorbell rang. I was so scared because I was home alone, and this has never happened to me before in my neighborhood. I decided to look at the call log on my phone and found the number. The person never picked up, of course. It just said call canceled. I blocked it in case he called himself or something, but I just felt so scared. Just thinking about his footsteps getting louder and faster each time I went in front of him made me start to freak out when I thought about it. This experience happened to my roommates and I in our second year of university. The city we went to school in was considered a very safe university town. The most we had heard of happening was drunk morons doing typical drunk moron things. This is also the first time that we were all really living on our own. First-year residents are nice, but It's basically an extended summer camp rather than a typical living situation. The four of us girls lived in a nice townhouse that never once had a creepy vibe or weird neighbors in the months we had lived there. The only eerie part was that every weekend we were the only people who stayed in the complex. All of our neighbors either went home or stayed elsewhere until returning Monday for classes. This was never something we had given a second thought to, considering that was fairly normal for our uni town. Especially because our complex was only made up of about 4 other townhouses. The complex was surrounded by walking trails and farm fields, which we loved. It was like a quiet spot away from the chaos of college kids. There were a few farmhouses we could see from our backyard, but other than that, we were fairly secluded. The university was about a 20-minute bus ride away, which was never a big deal for any of us, especially because the rent was far cheaper here than in places that were within walking distance to campus. Being 5'6", I was the tallest by a considerable amount. I was also the only one out of the group who had been in a handful of scary situations. Due to this, I was the only one up to this point who would lock the doors, windows, and garage before leaving or going to bed. My roommates all grew up in small, very safe towns, so it was uncommon for them to lock doors back at home. They were also incredibly kind and trusting to everyone, never considering hidden bad intentions. The night in question started very normally. We had planned on having a wine and a movie night, and this was all kind of like a weekly tradition for us. We would pick out some stupid movie, get takeout, and get a little buzz after a long week of classes and work. At this point, it was early November, so we had been doing this for several months with no issue. By 8:30-ish, we had all settled on the couch in our living room and had started a comedy. With it being November, it was already completely dark outside, other than our porch light we could see from the small window at the very top of our door. None of us were tall enough to see anything out of that window anyway, so we relied entirely on our peephole. It took a great amount of effort for me to convince my roommates to check the peephole before opening the door. This is a talk we had after one roommate had opened the door for our neighbor's very drunk friend, who threw up all over our main floor. Not long after ordering our takeout, we heard banging on our front door. Jess made a joke about how the delivery guy must have taken a helicopter to get here this quickly, especially considering the place we ordered was very close to campus. It was not a typical delivery guy's knock either, but between the few glasses of wine and carefree attitude of that night, we didn't really pay it too much mind. It was my roommate's turn to pay this week. I'll call her Meg for the sake of the story. Out of the group, she is the smallest, barely 5 feet, and she is also the most trusting person I think I ever met. She ran up to her room to grab her wallet, and this took at most 30 seconds. And during this time, the banging continued and was getting more aggressive. I figured maybe it was cold or he had other stuff to do, so we yelled to get her to hurry. The banging continued to get harder and harder, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. When she came back down, I told her to check the peephole before opening it, as she was usually the one to just open up. She got to the door and looked out the peephole, and she could barely reach it on a good day, so when she said she couldn't see anything, my other roommate and I got up to help. My second roommate, I'll call her Jess, is a very funny person. There are very few things that she would not turn into a joke. Jess got to the door before I did and looked out the peephole, the person on the other side still banging away. When she turned to look at me, I knew something was wrong. She looked incredibly confused, a look I had rarely seen from her as she was very clever. Within a second, she had gone back in for another look. This time her face was not confused. She looked afraid, and this made my stomach knot up. She is a horror movie fanatic, and she doesn't scare easily. I think someone is covering the peephole, she whisper-shouted at us. This time I looked out the peephole, seeing that, yes, something was covering the peephole. We could still see the porch light shining through the window at the top, so we knew it was not a case of it being too dark to be able to see what was going on. By now our other roommate, whom I'll call Anne, had walked down the hall trying to find out what was going on. She was easily the drunkest of the 4 of us. Even sober, though, she seemed to think that she was invincible. "What's your problem? Just open the door. The poor dude has his hands full," was Anne's wise idea. Jess and I explained what was going on. At this point, Meg, Jess, and I all had a gut feeling that something was wrong. That's when Jess asked Meg to check the website that she had ordered food on. Meg had not placed the order. Between the wine and the silliness of the earlier night, she had selected our food but didn't finish the last step. The banging continued as our situation started to sink in. Anne, still not seeming to grasp what was happening, and tried to unlock the door. "Stop!" I snapped at her. Immediately I knew it was too loud. For the first time, the person on the other side of the door spoke. "This is the police. Open the door now. We have a few questions for you." A man's voice practically growled back at us. This sobered me up right away. I looked over at Meg, who was already welling up, then at Jess, who had gone completely pale. At this point, Anne also realized something was not right and froze, which is the least Anne thing she could have done. The banging was getting increasingly harder, to the point we could physically see the door breathe with each hit. Meg took Anne upstairs, trying to calm each other down and check if there was a police car parked outside and make sure our windows were locked. Though it was hard to do, it was possible to get onto part of our roof that made it possible to get to Anne's window. We heard a window slam, immediately knowing that it had been Anne's window. Being a bit of a thrill seeker, Anne had taken out her window screen in order to sit on the roof. For some reason, this made what was happening very real. Show me your badge and then we'll open the door," I yelled back. Instead of a response, it sounded like the guy started to kick the door. I told Jess to call the police and ask if they had an officer dispatched to our address. Jess was shaking so badly at this point that it was hard for her to dial. Now Meg had come back down the stairs, sharing that there was no police car parked outside. Anne trailed behind her, standing on the stair landing, trying to get a look outside the window at the top of the door. At that moment, my blood ran cold, remembering that the man at the door had said, "we," and not "I." Jess had just come to the same realization. She sprinted to our back door, a large sliding glass door which she double-checked that was locked, and thankfully it had been. She drew the curtains as well, trying to minimize the chance of them seeing in. Within a minute, the knocking started at our back door as well. Thank God she had closed the curtains, because the idea of seeing whoever was doing that still gives me chills. "Uncover the peephole and show me your badge," I yelled, trying to sound as intimidating as a young college girl could. We were met with silence, which was so much worse than the banging. "What's your badge number at least? Just prove to us that you're the police," I screamed, trying to keep my voice from breaking. The only response I got back was a gravelly, "I can't do that." Jess had handed her phone off to Meg, who was now sobbing, trying to speak to the dispatcher. The banging now, coming from both sides of the house, must have been heard by the operator. "Is there someone trying to break in?" she asked Meg, obviously being unable to understand her. Meg frantically asked if police had been sent to our house. The answer we all knew by now was no. Meg babbled that at least 2 men tried to get us to unlock the door by impersonating a police officer. "Try to stay calm. Stay on the phone with me. Police are on their way to your address," the operator told Meg. "How long will they be?" Meg answered back. "No more than 10 minutes, she responded. That made Meg cry harder, realizing just how long 10 minutes really is. The door was being hit so hard I worried it would break, and Jess ran back toward our back door, making me worried that our kitchen window had been opened. Trying to think, I put a chair under the doorknob and sat down, hoping the door would hold. Jess came back to the front door holding a kitchen knife and a fire extinguisher, which were the only things we had to protect ourselves with in case they got in. Anne, now sitting on the landing, flinched with each hit. Anne was farm tough and had no issue dealing with animals 3 times her size. What was happening now, though, was entirely different. We had nothing to really deter whoever wanted in. No prods and no backup until the real police show up. Not like what she was used to. She grew up having a family as her neighbors her whole life. If anything was happening, her uncles and grandfather were at her front door in a minute flat. Anne's "I'm invincible" attitude was long gone. She was now as scared as the rest of us, only having some wood and glass keeping these men out. Each hit to the back door made me expect whoever was there to break through the glass. "Open the door!" The man yelled at us, not caring if we thought they were the police anymore. Then it got very quiet again, which made me want to throw up. The only thing worse than what was happening was not knowing where the men were. The idea of both men moving to the back door made me absolutely terrified. If they really wanted to, it would be very little effort to smash through the plate glass. Instead, the knocking at the back door had completely ceased. Within seconds of that, the front door started being hit again. Trying to wrap my mind around why they would leave the easiest entry for a heavy wood, I realized the back door was visible to the main road where they had seen a car or heard us talking to the police, and they were smart enough not to want to be seen by anyone. Jess then said something that I'd not thought of. "I don't think they want to rob us. There's so many houses that are empty. Why would they come to the only house with lights on?" She hissed. My whole body went cold, and I didn't have an answer, and all I could say was, "You're right." Meg clearly felt the same because at this point she was practically hyperventilating. The three of us stayed quiet for a while, awful scenarios running through our heads. Anne moved back to the last few steps and out of sight. The operator, who we had forgotten was on speaker, spoke, which practically made me jump out of my skin. She must have felt how terrified we were and tried to calm us down. "The police are 2 minutes away. They have their sirens turned off and lights are on. You should be able to see them very soon. Stay on the phone with me so I can confirm when they're outside for you," she said. The men outside were starting to seem desperate. The sound of glass shattering had me turning to the back door, fully expecting to go into offense. The door was still intact. Instead, our porch light, the only light illuminating our dark street, went out, which put 2 and 2 together for me, understanding that they had destroyed the only way we would have been able to identify whoever was on the other side. "Screw you!" A voice which we hadn't heard before, whoever was at the back door, spat at us. And this was worse than the initial speaker. It was full of so much hate and venom that it scared me more than the beginning. He was so calm, intent on whatever his goal was. It didn't feel like how the first man had sounded. Up until this point, I could have convinced myself that they had wanted our valuables, but this voice made me understand that he had wanted us. To this day, I had never heard a voice come close to that level of malice. It sounded like he wanted to inflict serious harm on us, and if he had gained entry, I know he would have. Somehow I wanted the first man to speak again instead of whichever sick freak had just spoken, and I looked at Meg. I know how terrified I must have looked. Until now, I may have done a half-decent job at hiding how scared I was, but that voice ruined my ability to stay stone-faced. Meg looked like a little scared girl, and that had me panic. If they got in, there was nothing I would be able to do to stop them. Not for me, and not for my friends. We would have been at the mercy of the monster outside. Jess had practically stopped breathing. It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. It was so quiet it sounded like a gunshot when our mailbox opened. Anne ran back down the stairs. "I see the sirens. They're coming down the main road now," she whispered, hoping not to have the men hear. The same man spoke again one more time, so slowly that I almost thought he was done after each word. In that same awful, calm voice, he read out a letter addressed to the 4 of us. Our neighbor must have put it in today. She had planned a potluck for the next week, and none of us thought to check the mailbox after we had talked to her in the driveway this morning. Jess, Meg, Anne, Sam. Those are nice names. I'll be back soon, girls, and then we'll have some fun. I felt tears rolling down my face. I hadn't realized I had started crying, but I knew he meant what he had said. I tried to pull my mind out of the dark pit that sentence had sent it to. Waiting, praying that the police had surprised them, hoping that they would not get the chance to come back. The silence continued, and none of us dared to speak, worried that we would not hear if they moved to another point of entry. Instead, the silence persisted for what felt like a lifetime. The operator was the first one to speak, telling us that the police are out front. She told us to stay in the house until the police knocked on the door. The kind woman stayed on the phone with us for several more minutes while the police searched around the area. Finally, the real police showed us their badge through the peephole before even knocking to try not to scare us. The operator told us that we had done well and that we were in good hands now. We opened the door to be met by two kind-looking older police officers who we let in. Glass shards covered our front stoop from our porch light. It looked like it had been ripped out of the wall and smashed onto the concrete below. There were several police cars out front of our previously quiet home. The headlights on all the cars were shining down the street towards the walking trail. We spoke to the officers who took a report from us. They asked us to describe the night's events in detail. They asked us if we saw them at all, and we explained how the peephole had been covered and the light had been smashed before moving away from the door. The officers advised us to speak to our landlord about at least installing security cameras. The older officer then closed the pad that he'd been writing in and looked up at us. He then spoke a phrase that made me understand how much danger we had been in. "Look, if any of you were my daughters, I would have wanted the officer to tell her. If you can get out of your lease, do it. They know where you all live, and they also know the response time for us, especially after telling all of you that he would be back." After that, they asked if we had heard a vehicle, and that was something I had not considered. We didn't hear any type of motor until the police were there. Even when Meg and Ann had looked for a police car, they said they saw no cars on the street at all, so likely that meant that they had come from the walking path, which would explain how they left without passing the police on their way back to the main road. The older officer of the two had a look that told me he had an idea of what was going on. He looked sad, which was worse than if he had looked scared. I knew that he had seen the situation end far worse in the past. We pushed for an explanation, but we were only told that this had been an issue ongoing for years, but didn't elaborate past that point. The officer stood up, exchanged a glance that I didn't know how to read, and then spoke again. "We'll have a cruiser parked in the driveway as well as a plain car parked out back. They're not going to have a chance to try again." They didn't catch the men in the 2 more weeks that we lived there. We had a few creepy things, but nothing close to this. The reality was that they had not been caught, and they could come back at any time. After this night, we spoke to our landlady, who was incredible. She owned several properties around the city, and when we explained what had happened, she let us move to an apartment closer to campus. She told us that our safety is more important than making a few $100s, and she even left the house empty for many months in order to make sure that cameras, better locks, and a reinforced back door were installed. Thankfully, they never came back, and we were able to enjoy our new apartment without worrying. This is still so scary to me because of that voice. Just make sure you lock your doors and check who's there before opening the door. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. This only happened yesterday, and it's been driving me crazy. It's not as wild as other stories on here, but it's by far one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me. So my husband and I are walking home from having a beer at the local pub at around 6 p.m. In terms of setting the scene, we live in a small New Zealand town, around 2,000 people in population. It's a real mixed bag in terms of residents. Older folk, meth heads, low income but increasingly commuters from the capital city have been settling here, and we fall into the latter category. It's spring here, so there was still plenty of light, and we're just chatting as we walk the 10 minutes or so home. About 3 minutes into the walk, at the first intersection on our walk, I spot a cat sitting on the fence of one of the corner houses on the other side of the street behind us. I say meow, and it meows back. It then starts stalking a bird, so my husband and I continue watching this house, the cat really, as we walk past. Suddenly, a person with a brown paper bag mask on their head kind of stumbles out of the front door of this house into the yard. Their mannerisms and how they're moving are so strange, but not what I'd associate with being drunk. The house itself seems completely dead, so there's no party or anything going on. The person then turns to us and makes eye contact. Well, the eye holes in the mask are staring at us, and they slowly start backing away to the front door alcove of the house and disappear from view into the alcove. We've been slowly walking this whole time, and at this point I have literal goosebumps and an intense sense of dread. When I write it down, it sounds so silly, but there was something so creepy about this person. We're still looking as we walk past the house, and the paper bag face slowly emerges from the alcove, watching us before disappearing from view again. As we walk and get further and further away, we keep turning around to look, and the same thing happens over and over again. Nothing, and then slowly but surely the paper bag face emerges out to watch us. And this continued until we were at the end of the street, about 350 meters, and rounded the corner out of sight. It still makes my skin crawl, thinking about it. I figured I'd post about an experience I had when I was 17. I'm 25 now. I'm a woman, dress size 24 to 26, and that will be kind of important later. I used to work at a popular women's wear plus-size store, and it was my second ever job, and I worked there 3 times a week after school. I usually worked closing with my manager and one other woman. However, our manager would leave around 6 p.m., and I'd be there till about 8 p.m. with my coworker. I should mention here that I was the youngest of our team. Everyone else was in their 30s and 40s, and there was some internal mistreatment as a result. A lot of it was them speaking to me like a toddler and making snide remarks about my appearances. I had piercings, dyed hair, stretched ears, etc. I had 2 core workers who I loved dearly. They were in their 30s and 60s, fabulous people who were also alternative, but sadly the rest were competitive and mean-spirited. There was one particular coworker who I was closing with that night, and she was very fend-for-yourself with almost all of the staff members. She was very proper, very religious, so she hated me, and she took everything super literally, a real peach. It was about 7:30 p.m., and we were just starting to do our closing tasks. I was putting clothes away, cleaning tables, etc., and my coworker was behind cash. A woman came in, maybe mid-50s, skinny, lanky, short hair, skin damage level tan, colorless eyes. I'm talking pupils and nothing else, and it looked like she lived in a fire pit. She didn't say much at first, but made a beeline for the lingerie, which is where I was cleaning. She looks over at me a couple of times, and I get the feeling that she's trying to steal. I subtly let my coworker know by using our code word in a sentence, and she notes the same thing. The evening goes on, but now under a more watchful eye. I kept an eye on the woman for about 15 minutes. During this time, she would shuffle between racks almost like a crab, side to side, back always facing me, muttering to herself, and her hands would move jaggedly and sharply towards different items. She almost looked animated. Her movements just felt so unnatural. Eventually, she turns around to face me, and she has a pile of lingerie hanging over her arm, and she smiles widely and says, "My wife and I had an argument. She won't let me back into our apartment until I get her a gift. I'm thinking something will benefit us both, if you know what I'm saying." It's at this point she nudges me. I, a nervous teenager, nervously laugh, and asks if she knows her wife's size, pointing out that she has grabbed multiple differently sized items. She ponders for a moment and says, "You got more brains than me. I don't know her size actually, but come to think of it, she looks a bit like you." As she's saying this, she begins holding up lingerie against my body, sizing me up. This made me extremely uncomfortable for obvious reasons. Any person touching me against my consent is a big no-no for me already, especially in a sort of objectified manner, regardless of who they are. I take a step back, turned to my coworker, and gave her the help me eyes. It was at this point my coworker shrugged and turned the other way. I could swear she was giggling at the situation. I realized I was now alone in dealing with this woman. I gently offered the alternative option, a bathrobe, a pretty safe bet and more flexible if it's oversized or undersized. Plus, you can return a housecoat. You cannot, however, return a lace thong. The shopper practically jumps at the idea, still giddy and animated, and I start to think she merely had a lapse of judgment before. But boy was I wrong. She takes the rope from my hands and goes, "Oh, this is perfect. But I'm still hesitant about the size. Say, you guys offer try-ons, don't you?" We did. We would sometimes model products for customers with limited mobility who wanted to see garments in action. She took my head at this and examined that we can do that for business attire but not casual wear or lingerie. She sighs, shuffles around and goes, "Well, you're about the same size as her. Let me hug you to be sure." Before I could react, she had her arms around me. I froze, couldn't feel my arms or legs. I remember my heart racing as she patted my back. Something kicked in and I took a quick step back, but I couldn't say anything. I was shocked. She smiles and goes, "That wasn't so bad, huh, baby?" And I was right. You're exactly like my woman. Curvy in all the right places. You're sure you can't amuse me and try this on? Every word put me on edge. I began stepping back to the safety of the cash counter where my coworker was, and it was at this time my coworker decided to go clean the fitting rooms. Once safely behind cash, I checked the time and said, No, I can't do that for you. Against store policy. Are you buying the robe? We close in 5 minutes." She seemed surprised at my change of tone. I'm in full freeze, flight, fight mode, and my emotions are all over the place, and I just want her gone. "Yeah, I'll take it." She said something like that. It's kind of blurry, and she goes to pull out her wallet, and surprise, surprise, no wallet in sight. She fumbles around to find cash for a good 5 minutes or so, and during this time she decides to go into extensive detail about her and her wife's intimate life, and how it got worse after they married. Eventually, she finds a crumpled up $50 bill and buys the robe, confirming that it is returnable. As she's leaving, she says, "If she doesn't like this, I'll be back tonight. If you're not here, I'll come back every day until you're here. I like you." I told her we were closed, and my coworker unlocks the door at this point and gestured for the customer to leave. She didn't have any parting words after that, but did blow a kiss at me on the way out. I winced at it, and that's all I know. My coworker giggled when the woman left and said, "She sure did like you." I didn't say anything back. I got my stuff and left. About 2 weeks later, I put in my 2 weeks notice following a similar incident involving a serial pooper using our changing rooms as a bathroom. He would also try on our women's lingerie, and that's a story for another time. Thankfully, the robe woman never showed up again while I was working, although at one point my manager told me a short-haired woman was looking for me during the early hours of the following day, and I'm certain it was probably her. This just happened this week. I was on vacation with my family and they were driving me insane after day 3. I decided maybe I'll take a look on Bumble and see if there were any cute locals to meet up with for an hour or two while my family went to more museums, which is not at all my interest. My family at home also thought it would be a funny story to meet up with a local. For reference, I'm a 25-year-old female and I was with my parents and younger sister for a week. We were in a remote-ish area in a small town out west, visiting a lot of national parks, so there weren't a lot of people nearby on the apps. I started swiping and soon came across a guy who was my age and looked cute, had similar interests as me, so I felt like I would be down to meet up with him. We started talking on the app, then eventually moved to Snapchat, and he suggested that we go to the next town over, which is about 30 minutes away, to see the fireworks. I couldn't that night since I had plans with my fam, and I was also hesitant about meeting a guy 30 minutes away when I was so already out of my element and we were in what felt like the middle of nowhere. He knew I was there doing hiking in parks, so he suggested we go for a local hike nearby the next day. A lot of great hiking trails around here, apparently. Now, an important side note, I deleted my last name on Snapchat before he added me, so he does not know it. I don't know if I had a bad feeling in the back of my mind or what, but I didn't want him knowing much of my info. However, it did show his last name, which is important later. I had hesitations about going into the woods with a random guy, especially since I had been around the hiking trails the day before and my cell service was cutting in and out. But the trails were well populated and I did want to see more out there, and my family was going to some museums that I had no interest in, so I agreed to meet him the next day. That night, I got a bad feeling and kept getting more nervous about meeting a random bumble man far from home in an area I don't know too well. Even though my family knew where I would be, I was feeling uncomfortable and decided maybe I should just Google this guy and see what other info I could find out about him, like his Instagram or LinkedIn, etc., so I could give my family his info while I was gone in case anything happened. I also wanted to verify what I knew about him, like his workplace and alma mater, etc. Well, I type in his first and last name and town that we're in into Google, and I click on the first link. The next thing I know, I'm looking at a registered offender profile with his full name, address, photo, description of his offense, etc., and it was fairly recent. I'm not sure if I can go into detail here about his offense, but I can assure you that had I not Googled this man, things could have turned out very, very badly for me. Or maybe not, but nonetheless, I'm shook that I almost met up with him. Please make sure to do your due diligence when meeting people off the internet. In 2015 to 16, I moved to Florida from California to go to college, and I was around 18 at the time. I was staying in a small studio by myself, pretty far from my university, but close enough to where my apartment was the hangout spot. To paint a picture of how it looked, it was in the shape of a rectangle with only one window. So you walked in, and it's the living area, then the kitchen, then the bathroom with closets on the right side of the wall. One particular night, I had about 6 friends over at my apartment. So it was 4 guys and 3 girls total, including me. We're partaking in illegal activities, drinking and smoking, but we're all under 21. So when I got a knock at my door, I thought it was my neighbor about to complain either about the smell or the noise. I checked the peephole and saw a lady whom I instantly recognized as a panhandler that's always at the corner street of my apartment complex. So I opened the door and asked her if I could help her with anything. She had a towel over her shoulder and said, "Hi, I've been going around door to door, but everyone keeps turning me away. I was wondering if I could please just take a shower. I promise I don't want anything else. I just want to clean myself." Any sane person would have said no and told her to keep moving, but I was a dumb 18-year-old empath that was high as balls and panicking in the moment. So I said yes, and I walked her into my bathroom, told her how to turn on the water and where the soap was, and walked out. The look of terror on my friends' faces was priceless. All at once, they started asking why I had done that and if I realized how dangerous the situation could be. Was there someone waiting for her outside? Did she have a gun? Was she about to rob us? One of them even went to the kitchen to grab all the knives and then hid them just in case she tried anything. And we were all so quiet, just anxiously waiting for her to finish showering. When she was done and came out of the restroom, I walked her to the door and she said, "May God bless you." And I never saw her again, not even at the corner. You could say what I did was stupid, but I know good karma will come for me one day. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I'm super ethereal.